In the summer of 1675, Baruch Spinoza wrote a letter to a man named Henry Oldenburg. Oldenburg was a German-born diplomat and naturalist who spent years in London as the first secretary of the Royal Society, the institution that gathered and compared scientific observations from across Europe. He was a careful man, a patient correspondent, someone who took the long view on questions of natural philosophy. He and Spinoza had been exchanging letters for over a decade. Spinoza wrote to him from The Hague, not urgently, not dramatically, in the measured tone of a man reporting on a decision he had already made and was at peace with. Here is what the letter said. After receiving your letter of the 22nd of last July, I set off for Amsterdam with the intention of printing the book which I had mentioned to you. While I was negotiating, a rumor spread everywhere that I had a book in the press about God, and that in it I strove to show that there is no God. At this, certain theologians took advantage of the occasion to complain about me to the prince and the magistrates. Moreover, the stupid Cartesians, suspected as they were of favoring me, tried to remove this suspicion by denouncing my opinions everywhere. When I learned this from trustworthy men, who also told me that the theologians were everywhere plotting against me, I decided to put off the publication I was planning until I saw how things would turn out. That is the letter. Those are his words. He folded it. He sealed it with his signet ring. The ring was something he had used his entire adult life, a simple thing. The wax closed over a single Latin word pressed into the design, corte, caution, a reminder he had carried on his hand across 30 years of careful, dangerous writing. He had gone to Amsterdam in late July 1675. He had spoken to his printer. He had been ready. And then the word had spread, the way word always spreads in a city practiced at managing the thoughts of dangerous men, and the world he was about to step into had closed its door before he reached it. He turned back. He returned to his rented room in The Hague. He returned to the desk with the manuscript locked inside it. He had 2 years left to live. He spent them not revising what he had written, but making certain it would survive him. I want to tell you today what was in that manuscript. What was in it that the theologians feared enough to go directly to the prince before the presses had even started? What was in it that the Cartesians, men who should have been Spinoza's philosophical allies, publicly denounced before anyone had asked them to? What Spinoza had spent 15 years building, alone, in rented rooms, in geometric propositions that worked like a chain, break the first link or accept the last. The book was called The Ethics, and its author was not afraid of it. He calculated. A burned book serves no one. A hidden manuscript outlasts the men who want it burned. That calculation was correct. Spinoza began writing The Ethics in 1661. He had been living in Rheinsberg, a small village south of Leiden, sharing a house with a community of collegiate dissenters, men and women who had left the established Reformed Church in the Netherlands and gathered for informal Bible discussion and quiet. They were not threatening people. They were readers, questioners, exactly the kind of community that found Spinoza's company interesting and made no demands on how he should think. He was 29 years old. He had been excommunicated from the Amsterdam Jewish community 8 years earlier, at 21, in a ceremony whose language was extraordinary even by the standards of a tradition that understood excommunication well. The specific grounds for the ban were never stated in the surviving record. He was expelled from his community, his livelihood, his language. He moved away, changed his name from Baruch to the Latin Benedictus, and started grinding lenses to pay his rent. And he wrote. What he built over the next 15 years was not a polemic. It was not a pamphlet or a protest or a set of pointed arguments against specific passages of Scripture. He had already done that. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, published in 1670 without his name on it, with a false city of publication, was the book that had made him famous and hated in roughly equal measure. What he wrote after the Tractatus was something different in form and in ambition. He chose the geometric method, definitions, axioms, propositions, corollaries, scholia, the structure Euclid had used for triangles and angles, applied instead to God and human nature and the mechanics of the human mind. I need you to understand why he chose that form. Not for elegance, Not because he admired Euclid aesthetically. He chose it because a chain of logical propositions is nearly impossible to selectively refute. You cannot dismiss Proposition 14 without first dismantling Propositions 1 through 13. You cannot reject the conclusion without identifying which premise is false. You can say you disagree with the result. But if you cannot show where the chain breaks, you have not refuted the argument. You have simply declined to follow it, and those are very different things. Most theological arguments can be dismissed by tradition, by authority, by the weight of what has always been believed. You cannot say that to a geometric proof. You have to find the broken link. The scope of what Spinoza was building was not limited to one doctrine. He was not writing a tract against prayer or a refutation of miracles or a criticism of the papacy. He was writing about the entire logical architecture that Christianity and Judaism and Islam could not function without. 5 books. Part 1, God. Part 2, the mind. Part 3, the emotions. Part 4, human bondage. Part 5, human freedom. Those 5 parts, in that order, constitute a systematic account of everything: what exists, how human beings know what they know, what drives human behavior, what enslaves people to their passions, and what freedom means in a universe of necessary causes. He wrote it in Latin. He shared pieces of it in letters with a small circle of trusted correspondents: Oldenburg in London, a few friends in Amsterdam, a handful of philosophers in Germany and France who understood what they were reading and kept it quiet. He showed it to no one who would misuse it for 15 years. And then in July 1675, he decided it was time. Let me tell you what Part 1 of the Ethics says. Not all of it. The full argument runs to hundreds of propositions and requires more than a single sitting. But I want to give you the architecture, because without it, the 1675 crisis makes no sense, and without it, the Church's fear makes no sense either. Part 1 begins with a definition. By God I mean an absolutely infinite being, that is, a substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses an eternal and infinite essence. That sounds, on first reading, like a definition a theologian could accept. Infinite being, eternal, infinite essence. These are familiar words from Christian philosophy. Aquinas used them. Augustine used them. The Nicene Creed moves in this territory. But then you follow the propositions where they lead. Proposition 14, except for God, no substance can be or be conceived. If God is the only substance, the only fundamental self-existing reality, then everything else that exists is not a separate substance. It is a mode of God, an expression of God, a way in which God's infinite nature manifests. The stone in the road is a mode of God. The tide on the North Sea is a mode of God. You are a mode of God, not spiritually, logically, as a physical consequence of what it means for God to be the only substance. Proposition 17, God acts from the laws of his nature alone and is compelled by no one. This sounds like freedom. But follow the corollary. God acts from necessity. The laws of God's nature are not chosen. They are what God is. God cannot act against them any more than a triangle can have 4 sides. The triangle does not fail to have 4 sides because it is restrained or obedient. It does not have 4 sides because it is a triangle. God's necessity is like that. What this means, and here is where the architecture of the Church begins to develop cracks, is that God cannot will differently than God wills. Not different rules, not a different universe, not different outcomes than the ones that follow necessarily from what God is. Read Part 4, the preface. 1 sentence. That eternal and infinite being we call God, or nature, acts from the same necessity from which he exists. God, or nature. Deus sive natura. Not God and nature as separate things. Not God above nature, operating it from outside like an engineer with a control panel. God identified with nature. God being nature. Every natural event, every tide, every illness, every birth, every death, not merely permitted by God or caused by God, but being God. Being the necessary expression of what God is. Now I need you to sit with what this eliminates. Prayer. If God acts from the necessity of God's own nature And that necessity does not include responding to requests from individual humans, because responding would require God to change what would otherwise happen, and change requires a will that can alter its course, and God cannot alter course. Then prayer does not function the way it was taught to you. There is no mechanism by which a specific petition reaches a God who then adjusts the universe in response. Miracles. Every event in the natural world is a mode of God acting necessarily. For a miracle to occur, the laws of nature would have to be suspended. But the laws of nature are the expression of God's nature. Suspending them would require God to act against God's own nature. A God who is infinite and necessary cannot do this, not because he lacks power, because God is what he is, and what he is does not include the capacity to contradict himself. And then divine punishment and reward. If God acts from necessity, God does not have preferences about individuals. God cannot love you personally, cannot be angered by you personally, cannot decide, on the basis of your behavior, to bless your harvest or cause your business to fail. This is not a God of indifference. This is a God who is structurally incapable of caring about individuals, because caring about individuals requires exactly the kind of responsive will that the first 17 propositions of the ethics have already demonstrated God cannot have. This is not atheism. I want to be precise about that because Spinoza spent his life being accused of it, and the accusation misses the point entirely. Atheism says God does not exist. Spinoza says God is everything that exists. The difference is not cosmetic. It is the difference between a vacuum and a universe so full of God that there is no space for anything else. What Spinoza offers is something more precise than atheism, and in some ways more devastating to the institutional church. A God who is real, infinite, everywhere, and completely incapable of doing what the church promises on God's behalf. Parts 3 and 4 of the ethics go further. If God acts from necessity, and if human beings are modes of God, then human beings also act from necessity. What we experience as choice, the deliberation, the sense of weighing options, the felt experience of deciding, is the experience of not knowing all the causes that determine what we will do. The decision feels free because we are inside it and cannot see the full causal chain that produced it. But the choice was determined, the same way the tide was determined, long before the moment of making it. Proposition 32, Part 3. The will cannot be called a free cause, but only a necessary cause. I want to tell you about an afternoon at the UT Hodges Library, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. I had been reading the ethics in pieces for a while. Not systematically, not the way you should read a geometric argument from the beginning, but circling back to passages I didn't fully understand, working through Edwin Curley's translation with the notes. I was sitting in a carrel on the second floor, afternoon light coming through the tall windows. A quiet Thursday, students walking past occasionally, book open to Part 3. I reached Proposition 32. I read it. I read the demonstration. I read it again. Then I put the book down on the carrel and just sat there for a moment. I had been a deacon for 22 years. I had taught Sunday school. I had watched people I genuinely cared about carry guilt for things they had done, things they had been told were sins, things they had been told revealed the corruption of their nature, things they had been told required confession and contrition and the ongoing work of repentance to hold at bay. I had felt that guilt myself. The specific weight of a Sunday morning spent feeling inadequate in the presence of a God who was tallying failures. And here was a proposition, arrived at through logical steps I could not identify as false, that said the following. Every emotion you experience, desire, anger, lust, fear, pride, guilt, arises from causes you did not choose and cannot fully control. Every act that follows from those emotions follows as necessarily as a stone falls when you release it, not because you are weak, not because your nature is corrupted, but because you are a mode in a universe of necessary causes, and the experience of being you is the experience of all those causes acting through a single body with limited knowledge of what is happening to it. The category of sin requires that you could have done otherwise. It requires a will genuinely free to choose between obedience and disobedience. Without that freedom, without the real possibility of choosing differently, the concept of sin becomes incoherent. You cannot hold a stone responsible for falling. I closed the book, not dramatically, I just sat with the afternoon light coming through the windows and thought about 50 years of Sunday mornings spent feeling guilty for being human. Then I drove home. I am not telling you that Spinoza was right or that Christianity is wrong. I am telling you what I felt reading that proposition, the specific weight of a logical chain that dismantles the foundation of something 50 years of people in my life had built their lives on. Not because they were stupid, not because they were fraudulent, because they had never been shown this argument and asked to refute it. The church's power depends on sin being a real category, on guilt being an experience that requires absolution, on repentance being a transaction between a human being and a personal God who receives it and responds. Spinoza does not argue against those things. He does not debate them. He dissolves the logical categories they depend on. There is no transaction to conduct if God cannot receive transactions. There is nothing to be absolved of if the act that requires absolution was as necessary as the falling of a stone. That is what was in the locked desk. Stay with me. Now let me take you back to July 1675 and tell you what actually happened, because the letter to Oldenburg gives you the outline, and the outline does not carry the full weight of it. Spinoza had announced his intention to publish in a letter to Oldenburg in the early summer of 1675. He was ready. The manuscript was complete. The printer in Amsterdam, Jan Ruwerts, a Mennonite publisher who had done the Tractatus 5 years earlier, under a false name and false city, was willing. He traveled to Amsterdam in late July, not a long journey from The Hague, a few hours by barge and road. He was 43 years old. He had already been excommunicated at 21. He had already watched the Tractatus condemned and banned across Europe. He knew exactly what he was carrying. He knew exactly what it would cost. And then, before the presses had even started, the word began to spread. Spinoza wrote to Oldenburg that a rumor spread everywhere. The language matters, not a review, not a critique from a theologian who had read the text and found it dangerous. A rumor, the kind of report that moves through the social machinery of a city before anyone has actually read what they are reporting on. The substance of the rumor was this: Spinoza had a book about God in press, and in it he strove to show there was no God. Now Spinoza knew that was not what the book said. You and I have just spent time with what the book actually says. Deus sive natura is not the absence of God. A God who is identical with nature and whose laws are expressions of infinite necessity is not a God who doesn't exist. It is a God who exists everywhere and in everything, a God simply incapable of doing what the Church promises on God's behalf. But the rumor did not require accuracy. It required audience. The theologians went immediately to the prince and the magistrates, not to Ruwerts's print shop, not to Spinoza, to the civil authorities. This was the machinery that had worked before, against the Tractatus, against Descartes in France, against Galileo in Rome. You do not argue with dangerous ideas in the marketplace, you remove them from the marketplace before they have a chance to be read. And then the Cartesians did something that Spinoza found notable enough to put in the letter. The Cartesians, the philosophical movement that had built on Descartes' separation of mind and matter, that had been the most sophisticated intellectual alternative to scholastic theology in the Dutch world, should have been Spinoza's natural allies. Descartes had questioned Aristotle. Descartes had proposed a mechanical universe. Descartes had insisted on following reason wherever it led. Instead, faced with the possibility of being associated with Spinoza's forthcoming book, they publicly denounced him. Afraid of being seen as Spinoza adjacent by the same theologians and magistrates who were now plotting, they sacrificed their philosophical consistency for their social safety. He wrote, "The stupid Cartesians, suspected as they were of favoring me, tried to remove this suspicion by denouncing my opinions everywhere. Stupid. It is the only word in the letter that carries heat. Spinoza was not a man who used emotional language carelessly, but the Cartesians had betrayed something more than him. They had betrayed the principle that reason should be followed to its conclusions, not abandoned when the conclusions became inconvenient. He called them stupid because they abandoned the method to protect the reputation that the method had given them." He turned back, not from fear. He had been excommunicated at 21. He had published the Tractatus under a false name and watched it banned and kept writing. Fear was not what turned him around. He turned back because of the calculation. A condemned book can be burned. A manuscript in a desk cannot be burned by people who do not know it exists. The theologians had shown their hand, exactly the mechanism they would use, exactly the authorities they would contact, exactly how quickly a printing operation could be shut down. And he had 2 years left to live, and something more important to arrange than martyrdom. He returned to The Hague. He wrote, "I resolved to put off the publication I was planning until I saw how things would turn out." He never revisited that decision. He had 2 years. He spent them not revising the book, but ensuring the book would outlast him. By the winter of 1676, it was clear to anyone who knew him that Spinoza was dying. He had been grinding lenses for most of his adult life. Precise work, the kind that required patience and a steady hand and years of practice, and the kind that filled a room, slowly, over decades, with fine glass dust. He had suffered from lung disease his whole adult life. By his last years, the tuberculosis was no longer something he could work around. He was 44 years old and visibly failing. He was still writing, still corresponding, still receiving visitors in the small room he rented from Hendrik van der Spik, a house painter in The Hague who had taken him in years earlier and become, over the long tenancy, genuinely fond of him. Van der Spik was not a philosopher. He was not part of the intellectual circle. He was a working man who noticed that his tenant was careful and quiet and did not cause trouble and was now clearly dying. At some point in those final months, no one recorded the exact conversation, Spinoza told van der Spik what to do when he died. There was a writing desk. Inside the desk was a manuscript. When Spinoza died, van der Spik was to send the writing desk to Jan Ruwerts in Amsterdam, the same printer who had been ready in July 1675 when the theologians had been faster. That was the trust, not a notarized document, not a legal instrument filed with any authority, a verbal instruction from a dying man to his landlord about a box of papers. The Amsterdam circle already knew it was coming. Jarig Jelles was a merchant, a spice merchant who had made enough money to retire and spend his remaining years pursuing the questions that interested him, which were exactly the questions that interested Spinoza. He had been supporting Spinoza financially for years, quietly without making demands. He wrote the preface to what would be called the Opera Posthuma, Spinoza's posthumous works, in Dutch, and had it translated into Latin by Lodewijk Meyer, a physician who had been part of the inner circle since the early 1660s. The ethics was the centerpiece. Surrounded by unfinished political treatises and decades of correspondence and an incomplete Hebrew grammar, the title page read, Opera Posthuma. The author's name appeared as BDS. 3 initials, not Baruch de Spinoza, not Benedictus de Spinoza. 3 letters, anonymous even in death. I have thought about that detail for a long time. He had published the Tractatus without his name on it, with a false city of publication, because the previous man who had written something this dangerous about religious authority had ended up face down in an Amsterdam canal. He had been cautious his whole life. The ring said caute, but the ethics was different. But the ethics was the argument he had spent 15 years building. The argument he had been turned back from publishing once. The argument that was, in some fundamental sense, the purpose he had given himself after excommunication had stripped away everything else. And he put 3 initials on it, because he wanted the arguments to speak, not his name to inflame, because the theologians who had run to the prince in 1675 would use the name Spinoza to dismiss what they had not read, because the initials would reach the people who needed the argument, and the people who needed the argument would recognize who had written it. The writing desk left The Hague shortly after his death. It arrived in Amsterdam. Ruwerts published the Opera Posthuma in the last months of 1677. Spinoza had died February 21st, 1677. He was 44 years old. The church moved fast. Within months of the Opera Posthuma being published, within months of the ethics being available for the first time to readers outside Spinoza's private circle, it appeared on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. The Catholic Church's list of books Catholics were forbidden to own, read, copy, or distribute. Not a formal theological deliberation requiring years of argument, a swift designation. This belongs to the list of things that should not exist. By June 1678, less than a year after publication, the States of Holland issued a formal ban on Spinoza's complete works. The language of the ban is worth sitting with. The books contain very many profane, blasphemous, and atheistic propositions. The ban prohibited not only owning and reading, but copying, distributing, and, this is the detail that tells you exactly what the authorities were afraid of, reworking his fundamental ideas. You could not take Spinoza's arguments and put them in different words. The idea itself was the crime. In Rome in late 1677, in the months when the opera posthuma was barely out of the printer's hands, a philosopher named Ehrenfried Walter von Tschirnhaus had traveled there carrying a handwritten manuscript copy of the Ethics. Tschirnhaus was one of the few men in Europe who had read it during Spinoza's lifetime. Part of the extended correspondence circle, one of the people Spinoza had trusted with portions of the text. A former student of his named Niels Stenson was also in Rome. Stenson had converted to Catholicism and renounced his earlier scientific career for theological work. He recognized what Tschirnhaus was carrying. He took the manuscript from him and delivered it directly to the Roman Inquisition. The Ethics reached the Inquisition before it reached most bookshops. The Church had the manuscript before the book was broadly available, and what they did with it was to file it as evidence of exactly what they had feared since the Amsterdam rumors of 1675, and move to suppress what had now escaped the desk and could no longer be unwritten. Over the next century, the pattern was this. European philosophers read Spinoza in secret. They did not always cite him. In many cases, they could not safely cite him, but his arguments moved through enlightenment, thought the way a current moves through water, not always visible on the surface, always present in what the surface is doing. Scholars have spent decades documenting what is sometimes called closet Spinozism. John Locke's political theory, David Hume's critique of miracles, Leibniz's metaphysics, Kant's critical philosophy, all of these carry the structural influence of arguments first made in the Ethics, and all of their authors either denied or carefully minimized how much they had read of Spinoza. And then there is the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was not a Spinozist by name, but the philosophical infrastructure of the American founding, a universe governed by natural law, rights that proceed from nature rather than divine revelation, the separation of church and state resting on the argument that no civil authority has jurisdiction over individual conscience in matters of religion, tracks directly to conclusions the Ethics had already drawn. Nature's God. The phrase appears once in the Declaration in the first sentence, before any of the rights are named. Not the God of Abraham, not the God of the Nicene Creed, nature's God. The God whose authority authorizes natural rights is not a God who intervenes in political arrangements, but a God whose laws are the laws of nature itself. That is a phrase Spinoza would have recognized. The Church had been right about what it feared. Not right that the Ethics was atheism. It was not. Not right that it was blasphemy in the traditional sense. Right that it was dangerous. Right that a book which dissolved the logical foundations of prayer, miracles, free will, sin, and divine authority over human conscience would eventually find its way into the reasoning of men who were building something new, something that did not require the approval of a bishop to be legitimate. The Ethics did not end Christianity. Christianity is still here, the churches are still full. But the certainty, the philosophical certainty that Christianity had claimed for 1500 years about the nature of God and the structure of the universe, that certainty was gone. The Enlightenment was built in the space the Ethics had opened, the space between what the Church claimed to know about God and what could actually be demonstrated through reason and evidence. Spinoza had calculated correctly. Baruch Spinoza died on February 21st, 1677. He was 44 years old. He had spent roughly 20 years grinding lenses to pay his rent. He had spent 15 years building the most systematic philosophical argument against the Church's authority over human thought that the Western world had yet produced. He had spent 2 years at the end of his life making sure that argument would survive him. He tried once to release it. He was stopped by the same forces he was writing against. He made the calculation that a hidden manuscript was worth more than a burned book. He told his landlord to send the writing desk to Amsterdam. He put 3 initials on the title page. He died in a rented room of the lung disease that 30 years of glass dust had given him. He never saw the book published. I have spent a long time with this story. Not only the doctrinal argument, the logical content of the ethics, which is its own education, but the human architecture of what Spinoza did in those last 2 years. The specific choice a dying man makes about what to do with the most important work of his life, when the world has already told him, clearly, that the world is not ready for it. He did not destroy the manuscript. He did not revise it to make it safer. He did not entrust it to an institution or an official archive that would be subject to the same pressures that had already shut down the Amsterdam presses. He told a house painter to send a box to a Mennonite printer. He trusted 3 men, a retired spice merchant, a physician playwright, a publisher, to do the rest. The ring said Cote. He was cautious his entire life. The Tractatus published without his name, the ethics kept private for 15 years, the turn back from Amsterdam when the rumors began. He understood what carelessness cost. He had watched it cost other men everything, but caution is not the same as uncertainty. And what stays with me, sitting with this story across all the years I have spent with it, is how clear Spinoza was, not triumphant, not certain that the ethics would change everything in his lifetime or the next generation. Clear that the argument was sound. Clear that truth has a different timetable than men do. Clear that his job was not to win the argument in his own lifetime, but to preserve the argument until the world was capable of having it. He spent 15 years building the argument. He spent 2 years arranging for it to survive him. He left behind the manuscript. That is the truth of it. Make of that what you will.